There's a lot of drama on BookTube lately, isn't there? It's a little bit disappointing. What's shaking, BookTube? My name's Cam and welcome back to another video. Today I'm talking about a bit of a bookish drama that has been going on for much too long. I think we can all agree that every time we see this subject pop up, everyone kind of gives out a collective "Oh!" no matter which side of the fence you're on. Every couple of months it comes up again, and time again, people just don't seem to see eye to eye. Well, I've never really commented on it, but today I am. Is listening to audiobooks reading? Is it really?
Today we will be discussing the benefits of rolling the intro.
The question, is listening to audiobooks reading, is not really so simple. I've seen arguments from both sides of the fence, and it always comes down to one of three kind of camps. I'm going to call them camps, but basically they are schools of thought that define what your answer is when someone asks you, is listening to audiobooks reading? And that is the literal definition, the comprehensive and educational benefits of audiobooks versus reading from books, and the societal definition. And the problem when people argue about this topic is that they are arguing from different camps. Essentially, they are both trying to answer different questions and getting confused and angry when they don't come up with the same answer. And yes, I have an answer to, if someone was to ask me the question, do you think listening to audiobooks is reading? I have an answer for that, an answer I feel pretty strongly about, but you're going to find out about that a little bit later. For now, we'll take a stroll through the three camps and we'll figure out basically the answer to that question in all three camps, and figure out if that changes the opinion for anyone out there. At the very least, it should make having this conversation a lot easier going forward if we try and understand what the question is that the other person is trying to answer. It may sound like the same question to us, but we may be listening to it in different interpretations. In the literal sense, is listening to audiobooks reading? No, that's just an objective fact. Listening to an audiobook is literally not reading. By definition, reading is looking at words, symbols, any kind of language that you are literally absorbing with your eyes and turning into information. Listening to someone telling you something is just, it's just not reading, literally speaking. And you'll find that this is the camp that most of the people who answer the question, is listening to audiobooks reading, and they say no, this is the camp that they're answering from. Because when they hear that question, they're going to the literal definition, which is, of course, no. Camp number 2, comprehensive and educational benefits in reading from the book versus listening to an audiobook. Now this is kind of the battleground where a lot of the people saying yes it is and no it isn't kind of clash. And that is that, are you getting the same thing out of listening to an audiobook as you would if you were to read it physically from the page? This is a bit more of a subjective question to answer because it comes down to so many different factors, most of which being the individual themselves. You can have someone who absorbs information and retains it a lot better reading from the page than they do listening to it. And vice versa, you could have it the opposite way around as well. But really that's not a good enough answer to the question, is listening to audiobooks reading, when we're talking about comprehensive and educational benefits. And the good news is that there have been plenty of studies done on this, which I will of course put in the description. I'll be putting all of my sources in the description below. When we're talking about educational benefits, we're talking especially about non-fiction. But through almost all of the studies that have been done, speaking on averages of course, reading from the page is much better than listening to an audiobook if you're wanting to retain the information. That comes down to a few factors. First of all, of course, would be that when you listen to an audiobook, it's usually because you're multitasking. In fact, that's how Audible sells the product of audiobooks. It's, you can do this while you're doing other stuff. That's what most people say that they love most about audiobooks. That's what I love most about audiobooks. I listen to audiobooks while I'm at work because I work on computers, and it's not that difficult to listen to a fiction story while I'm working. But it's just fact that when you multitask, you are not putting your full attention towards one thing, and that does chip away at the ability to retain that information and understand it a lot better. There's a second reason it's more beneficial in that group to read from the page rather than an audiobook, and that is this really interesting thing that I only found out about in actually researching for this video, but it's super cool. It's a bit of knowledge you can tell your friends about, but basically it's that when you're reading from the page, what your eyes do is every couple of words, and you won't notice this because it's very quick and it's very subtle and it's a subconscious action, but basically your eyes go back and reread what you just read. Basically, you're reading the whole thing twice, which is really cool. It's just a subconscious thing that your brain does to make sure that you are understanding what it is that you're trying to absorb and what you've put your attention towards. That's just not something you get out of listening to an audiobook. In fact, it's quite the opposite when you couple that with multitasking. So while it might feel pretty inconsequential when you're talking about, fiction books, when you listen to maybe the Harry Potter audiobook versus reading the Harry Potter physical book, you'll still know all of the major things that happen, but there's just all these little intricacies that you might not notice. And then obviously there's the final kind of mark on the topic of comprehension and educational benefits, and that is that reading physically from a book, especially if you're planning to write or be a writer or do some kind of occupation that involves writing, reading is pretty much the best way to absorb proper uses of grammar, spelling, context, all that kind of stuff. That's something you absolutely won't get out of it if you are only listening to audiobooks. Like I said, if you are a writer or if you plan on being a writer, I would really encourage that you do try and read physically from the book as much as possible. But then that takes us on to the last thing, and this is kind of where all of the people who answer yes to the question, is listening to audiobooks reading, they answer yes to this, and that is the societal definition. And this is where I'll tell you how I feel about it. If someone was to ask me, do you consider listening to audiobooks reading? I would say yeah, because I know that when someone comes up to me and they asks me, for example, have you read the new Blake Crouch book? And if I know that I only listen to it by audiobook, it would be redundant for me to say, no, I haven't read it, but I did listen to it by audiobook. That's not what they're asking me. They just want to discuss the story with me. Let's say that person read it physically and I listened to the audiobook. We both absorb the same content. And when people are discussing books and literature, especially on a format or platform like BookTube, we aren't talking about the physical act of reading. We aren't saying, how great is it to look at words and absorb that information? We want to discuss the content of what was read. It's a story or it's a group of information that we are consuming. By the societal definition, reading has become a lot more than just looking at lines on a piece of paper and turning it into information. In the sense of BookTube, reading now is basically taking any book, whether it be a physical book or an audiobook, and consuming the content of that book. That is the societal definition, and that is what most people are talking about when they discuss reading books. So for that reason, I consider listening to audiobooks reading. And perhaps not in the most educational or comprehensive sense, but yeah, in the sense that 99.9% of the conversations I have about books is on BookTube, listening to audiobooks is reading. In fact, most of the books I've read recently have been in the form of audiobooks because I just don't have the time to sit down and put all of my attention into a physical book right now. And yet fancy that, I'm still here talking about books. So the next time this conversation comes up, just, I suppose, try to see what the actual question is that the other person is answering. Let's say you, like me, consider audiobooks reading, but you're talking to someone who says, no, it's not. Just consider the fact that they're probably talking about the literal sense and they're not wrong. And if you are one of the people who say, no, listening to audiobooks is not reading, and you're talking to someone who says, yes, it is, consider that maybe they are just talking about the broader sense of consuming a story or a group of information that has at some point been a physical book. Because at the end of the day, who gives a shit? We're all here talking about books. No one cares about the nuances of how you've consumed the book. We're all sick of seeing this argument come up. It's silly. At least with this video now, the information has been broken down to its real core, and at the most, it could be, I guess, disagreements about the social interpretation of reading rather than the literal sense, and blah, blah, blah. Who cares? Who cares? As always, thanks for watching, guys. If you want to let me know what you think about the question, is listening to audiobooks reading, feel free to leave a comment. I'll see you in the next video. Catcha.